In 1962, two teenagers got into a fight in the New York City subway. Just another street brawl. The city had a dozen of those on a slow day. A week later, 200 people were in hospitals. 4 were dead, and police had cordoned off several blocks of Manhattan because one kid turned out to be a shark, the other a jaguar, and both sides decided the correct response to a bloody nose was to mobilize the entire neighborhood. Wars work exactly the same way. Just swap out the neighborhoods for nations, the switchblades for armies, and scale the consequences until you want to physically travel back in time and ask, guys, are you serious right now? Today, 10 wars that started exactly like this. You're watching Academic Troll, the channel for people who want to know more without being bored to death in the process. Like, subscribe, let's go.
Chapter 1. The Ear in a Jar. History's most effective diplomatic prop. 1731. British Captain Robert Jenkins is quietly hauling cargo through the West Indies when a Spanish Coast Guard vessel pulls him over. The Spanish search the ship. Then, for educational purposes, they slice off Jenkins's ear. Jenkins could have filed this under rough day at sea and moved on. Instead, he preserved the ear in a jar of brandy and carried it around for 7 years, like a man building a court case before anyone knew there was a courtroom. In 1738, Parliament summons him for testimony. He walks in, sets the jar on the table, and goes quiet. Lords in powdered wigs, the smell of tobacco and oak paneling, official state documents, and a human ear floating in spirits, dead center. Someone asks what he felt in that moment. "I commended my soul to God," Jenkins says, "and my cause to my country." Parliament erupts. Britain declares war on Spain in 1739. 35,000 people die before the whole thing drowns in the even larger War of the Austrian Succession, which had by then swallowed half of Europe. 1 ear, 7 years of pickling, 35,000 dead. The conflict is officially called the War of Jenkins's Ear. Jenkins himself received a comfortable government posting and lived to a quiet retirement. The ear did more for his career than every other part of his body combined.
Chapter 2. 1 pig, 2 armies, 0 common sense. San Juan Island, 1859. The territory is disputed, but American and British settlers are managing to coexist silently, with tight smiles, like coworkers after a company party where something went sideways. One morning, American farmer Lyman Cutler walks outside and finds a British-owned pig methodically destroying his potato garden. Cutler picks up his rifle and shoots it. The pig's owner demands $100 in damages. Cutler's response is, roughly, that the pig owes him for the potatoes. What follows is several months of escalating grievance until Britain sends a warship and 2,000 soldiers, and the U.S. answers with 3 ships and 400 rifles. Both sides dig trenches, load artillery, and wait for someone to blink. Commanders on both sides admitted afterward that a single accidental shot would have triggered a full-scale war. The stakes? 1 dead pig and a few dollars worth of root vegetables. The conflict is recorded in history as the Pig War. Total casualties? 1. The original combatant, who fell on the potato front. For 12 years, both nations kept military garrisons on the island. 2,000 soldiers on a 30-square-mile rock in the Pacific. Over a pig. The arbitration that eventually settled it took 3 weeks. Nobody ordered more troops for the negotiation.
Chapter 3. The Bill Nobody Paid. Mexico City, 1838. French pastry chef Raymontel runs a small bakery on the outskirts of the capital. One day, a group of Mexican army officers walks in, eats their fill of pastries, bread, and chocolate, and walks out without paying a single peso. Raymontel spends 10 years filing complaints with the Mexican government. They're ignored. He writes to the French ambassador. The ambassador writes to Paris. And here is where it gets interesting. King Louis Philippe had been looking for leverage over Mexico regarding unpaid debts, and suddenly here's a baker. France submits a claim, 600,000 pesos. Raymontel's share, 60,000, despite his entire shop being worth roughly 1,000. The rest? Other French citizens who smelled opportunity and filed their own grievances immediately. Mexico refuses to pay. In November 1838, the French fleet begins shelling Veracruz. One of the city's defenders, a future president named Santa Anna, loses his leg to French grape shot, and later arranges a state funeral for the limb, complete with military escort. The leg. Yes, Raymontel got his money. He entered history as the man whose unpaid tab caused France to bombard a Latin American port. Those pastries ended up costing more than his shop, his neighborhood, and possibly an entire year of Mexican trade through Veracruz.
Chapter 4. The Oak Bucket Theory of Just War. Medieval Italy, 1325. Modena and Bologna, two neighboring city-states that haven't agreed on anything in 100 years, have by this point accumulated enough mutual contempt to fuel a bonfire. One night, Modena soldiers slip into Bolognese territory and steal a wooden bucket from a well. Ordinary, functional, believed to be oak. Whether it even had a handle is lost to history, which tells you something about how carefully anyone was thinking. Bologna notices the missing bucket the next morning, declares national outrage, and calls up 30,000 soldiers, plus the forces of the Pope himself, because the disappearance of a pail clearly warranted papal intervention. Modena responds. The Battle of Zappolino becomes one of the largest engagements in medieval Italian history. Thousands dead on both sides, villages burned, fortifications destroyed, a campaign stretching months. Modena won. The bucket still sits in Modena Cathedral today, in a glass case with a plaque. Next to it, the casualty figures. The bucket looks at the tourists look at the bucket. Everyone in that room is quietly running the same arithmetic and arriving at the same answer. Chapter 5. The flagpole Heike gave them, and cut down 4 times. New Zealand, 1844. Maori chief Hone Heike personally gifts the British a flagpole, so the flag of the United Tribes could fly over Kororareka. The British accept the pole, take down the Maori flag, and raise the Union Jack. Heike looks at this, picks up an axe, and fells his own gift. The British put up a new one. Heike cut it down. Another one goes up, down again. The third time, the British sheathe the pole in iron and post a guard of 20 soldiers. Heike arrives at dawn with a war party, neutralizes the guard, and brings down the iron-wrapped pole. The fourth flagpole falls in March 1845. The war begins. 3 failed attempts, and the solution someone landed on was same pole, more iron. Heike read that as a dare, not a deterrent. The detail British accounts prefer not to dwell on. The pole was a gift. You take a man's gift, put your flag on it, and then act surprised when he comes back with an axe. That's not a diplomatic incident. That's a personality test. The British failed it 4 times in a row, each time more expensively than the last. Chapter 6. Official Defeat. By Birds. Australia, 1932. World War I veterans receive farmland and almost immediately discover that 20,000 emus have prior claims on it. The giant flightless birds systematically demolish crops, flatten fences, and ignore all human presence with the serene indifference of a natural disaster that hasn't been told it's a natural disaster. The farmers write to the government. The Minister of Defense responds without hesitation. We'll send the army. In November, a unit deploys to the fields with 2 Lewis guns, an official military operation against birds. The shooting starts. The emus scatter in zigzags, as if someone had specifically trained them for this. Thousands of rounds are expended. The birds return the moment the guns go quiet. Command shifts tactics. Nothing works. Within a week, the army withdraws. Major Meredith tells reporters that the emus appear to have a general staff and that each bird takes a burst and keeps walking. Headlines run. Emus win the war. Ornithologists take shots. Parliament goes red in the face. Meredith files a report that amounts to, the birds had better tactics. The emus still live in that region. This is the only war in recorded history where the winning side doesn't know it fought one and wouldn't care if it did. Chapter 7. The Dog That Started a War. October 1925. The Greek-Bulgarian border. A Greek soldier chases his dog, which has crossed into Bulgarian territory. The soldier, armed and in uniform, jumps the fence after it. Bulgarian border guards see a foreign military man on their soil and open fire. The Greek is killed. The dog survives, the only participant in this story who came through without consequences. Greece declares what happened an act of aggression. Within days, Greek troops occupy the Bulgarian town of Petrich. Artillery opens up on Bulgarian positions, and a border skirmish is quietly becoming a regional war. Bulgaria,
still running on fumes from the First World War, treasury empty, army half strength, sends a telegram to Geneva. The League of Nations calls an emergency session. Greece withdraws, reparations are paid. Roughly 50 people died. The whole thing, from the dog crossing the fence to the ceasefire, took less than a month. One telegram stopped what two armies couldn't. That detail got buried in the history books, because international institutions succeeding isn't a great headline. The dog, for its part, was never mentioned again in any official record. It simply went home.
Chapter 8. The Stool Nobody Sat On. Gold Coast, 1900. The Ashanti people have a golden stool, not a throne, the physical embodiment of the nation's soul. No one may sit on it, not even the king. He merely rests near it during sacred ceremonies. Asking to have it brought over so you can sit down is roughly equivalent to asking someone to box up their national god and have it delivered in time for lunch. British Governor Sir Frederick Hodgson does exactly that. He arrives at a meeting with Ashanti chiefs and announces, "I hear you have a golden stool. I wish to sit upon it. Bring it here, now." The room goes silent. A polite refusal follows. The British interpret this as insubordination. War. Thousands of soldiers, artillery, machine guns, the siege of the capital Kumasi, burned villages, a king sent into exile. The stool was never found. The Ashanti had hidden it so well, it didn't surface until the 1920s, long after everything was over. Hodgson was recalled to London, where he lived out the rest of his days in complete obscurity. The stool stands in Ghana to this day. Hodgson's name appears in footnotes. That, too, is a kind of verdict.
Chapter 9. Do they swim or do they crawl? Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Brazil, early 1960s. French fishermen are catching lobsters. Brazil says, "These are our territorial waters. Get out." France replies, "Lobsters swim. Therefore, this is the open sea, and we have every right to be here." Brazil objects, "Lobsters don't swim. They crawl along the seabed, and the seabed is ours." And so two nation-states spend months in formal diplomatic correspondence about the biomechanics of crustaceans, because the answer literally determines where the national border falls. It's the kind of argument that starts in a conference room and ends with frigates. France sends a warship, Brazil responds with ships and aircraft. 2 years of maneuvers, formal protests, and notes delivered with great diplomatic seriousness. No shots are fired. A treaty is signed, fishing continues under new rules, and the locomotion of the lobster remains officially unresolved in international law. Biologists had settled this decades earlier. Lobsters walk. Nobody thought to ask one. A 30-minute consultation with a marine zoologist would have cost less than a single day of naval exercises. But science doesn't get a seat at the table until after the warships have already left port.
Chapter 10. One race, 40 years of killing. Arabia, 6th century. 2 tribal chiefs bet on a horse race. 100 camels, 16 kilometers of desert, 40 days of preparation. Serious men doing serious things. The kind of serious that ends badly. The Abs entered a stallion named Dahis, the Gatafan a mare called Gabra. Dahis led easily, until the opposing tribe stepped onto the track and punched the horse in the head. Not a spear, not an arrow, a fist. Dahis stumbled, Gabra crossed first, and the winners demanded their camels. The Abs refused. Fraud. The Gatafan said, "Prove it." What followed was standard regional procedure. Killed the other chief's brother, got their own killed back, and the machine was running on its own fuel. 40 years. Nobody remembered what started it, but that's not how these things work. The machine didn't need a reason. It needed an insult, and it had one. Killed, avenged, killed, avenged. They almost settled once. The Abs chief agreed to accept blood money. The Gatafan chief refused. In the end, 2 merchants from neutral tribes, men whose trade the feud was destroying, paid the debt for both sides. Only then did it stop. Nobody got the 100 camels. In Arabic, the War of Dahis became a byword for any conflict that consumed its own cause and now runs on wounded pride alone. Standard regional procedure, as it turns out, has no exit clause. You know at least one of those.
What we are left with. The most uncomfortable thing about all of these isn't that they're funny. It's that in every single one, there's a moment where someone could have stopped, bought a different bucket, called a biologist, left the ear at home, But they didn't stop, because they already wanted to fight, and a reason just happened to be within reach. The ear, the pig, the pastries, the stool, these aren't causes. They're permission slips. People issue these to themselves, and they've been doing it for as long as history has been keeping score. And judging by the rate at which the archive keeps filling up, they have no plans to stop. That's all from me. Other channels usually circle back at the end to remind you about likes, subscriptions, and comments. I won't. I'll just be working on the next one, and you'll figure out what to do.